Welcome to Angular Catch-Up, the podcast where we dive into the latest trends and updates in the Angular ecosystem. I'm Derek.
And I'm Sonu. We're here to keep you up to date with all things about Angular.
Today we have two very special guests with us, Alex and Marko from the NgRx team. Thanks for joining us. Alex, could you tell our listeners a bit about yourself?
Hey guys, hey everybody else. It's nice to join this podcast. I'm Alex Okrushko. I'm currently front-end lead at a company called Snowflake. I'm part of Angular GDE and part of the NgRx team for quite a while now. Yeah, happy to join here.
And thank you for joining. Marko.
My name is Marko Stanimirović. I work as a principal front-end engineer at a company called Swiss Marketplace Group. And I'm also GD in Angular and member of the NgRx team. Happy to be here today.
Awesome. All right. So to kick things off, Alex, what is SignalStore and how is it different from NgRx? Oh, SignalStore. Yeah, SignalStore is part of the new NgRx Signals package. And this is the package that actually Marko here was the lead author of that package. And it was NgRx team's attempt to stay together with the latest developments in Angular, including Angular Signals. All right. And we took a look, how can we use this upcoming or now existing new reactive primitive from Angular? And how can we make sure that we utilize the best of it? That also allowed us to take a second look at our existing state management libraries. And because we already had two before, right? We have NgRx Global Store and we have Component Store, which was focused more on localized state and component state. And looking at those two things, how can we introduce something that is very much worth it? So basically, SignalStore is part of that. We'll definitely talk more about like what the good use cases for it, why we actually even have it. But generally speaking, NgRx Signals is a library for some of the utilities to work with Angular Signals, and SignalStore is also one of the new things that's part of that package. Marko?
Yeah, exactly as Alex mentioned, in addition to offering a state management solution, the idea with NgRx Signals package is to also offer utilities to work with Angular Signals, independent from the state management solution itself.
Is it more global, local state management, or both?
Yeah, good question. So the primary usage of SignalStore is for the local state management, and it's a direct successor of NgRx Component Store. But on the other hand, if for some reason Redux is not your cup of tea, you can use SignalStore to manage both. So you can go all in with SignalStore and use it for local as well as for the global state management. And by the way, this was also possible with NgRx Component Store. Some people did things like this. They use it Component Store for everything.
Again, we can probably start first discussing about signal state, right, Marko?
Yeah.
Probably a good starting point for to understand like what this NgRx Signals package introduced, and then we can take a look at why do you even needed the third state management library. Marko, you want to talk about a signal state? What does it do?
Yeah, signal state, as we mentioned, in addition to SignalStore, there are also some utilities that NgRx Signals package provides, and signal state is one of them. It's the extended version of Signal. So it has the same signature that Signal function has. In other words, it accepts the initial state as an input argument, but unlike the regular Angular signal, it will create deeply nested signals. For each nested state property, it will automatically create a signal. And this will be done in a performant way, of course. All the nested signals will be created lazily on demand. When you access them for the first time, they will be created, then they will be cached. So when we access them for the second, third time, the same instance of the created signal will be reused.
Yeah. Angular team, I mean, did a great job creating a signal, right? But a signal works really well for primitives, like string, number, whatever, right? But if you want to have an object, all right, and you want to access some properties of those objects, I mean, you can put the whole object in the signal, right? But then if you need a property, you need to call a signal on that, the entire object, and then you can drill down into specific property. Or what if you want like only one part of it? What do you want to make that single property to be a signal? If that's the only thing that in that component, for example, you care about. So state signal allows you to do that. It basically traverses that whole object and lazily, only when you access, creates the signal for every property at any level of nesting. It's pretty cool. It's very smart and very performant as well, as just Marko said. So think of this way. In component, you could have like 3 properties. And all those 3 properties could be independent signals, right? Not a big deal, right? But now you kind of have them separately. But you can combine them into one, say, hey, it's called state signal for this property. And you kind of encapsulate already saying, hey, these are the properties for this object that are signals that we care about. So there are many more, of course, use cases for it, but it's also a great building block for SignalStore itself, right? Because this is just the state, and the state that can, be deeper nested, right?
Yeah, actually, the idea with nested signals was first with the SignalStore. And then when we created SignalStore, we were thinking, oh, okay, maybe some people just want to have the utility for creating nested signals. They don't want to use the full opinionated solution with the SignalStore. So we created another utility signal state that only has this functionality with deeply nested signals. And as Alex mentioned, we can put the entire object into a signal, but then we will have some boilerplate code, because if we want to track the changes of the specific property, or if we want to trigger the change detection only when a specific property within the signal is changed, then we will need to manually create computed signals for each property of that signal. With signal state or SignalStore, this is not needed because they will be generated automatically.
Okay, that's interesting. So are there any use cases where you would suggest to use the SignalStore versus NgRx store? Yes, probably. So before we even dive into the one versus another, I think it'll be great to understand like what SignalStore is to begin with, right? And the way I see it, with advancements in Angular and with the things like inject functions, we can now look into more functional way of creating things, right? Like before that, we always needed classes to inject things into components, services, things like that. But so we were basically limited to classes, and NgRx, global store and component store are all class-based for that exact reason. Now, class-based are great, but there are certain limitations that class-based force you into. And one of the harder ones is you cannot really dynamically change the type of that thing, right? So for example, some properties you can, to auto-generate them, right? For example, for a specific class. You can put them in the class prototype, no problem, but you cannot type it correctly without some crazy stuff. So it's very much a problem that could be solved with a functional approach. Because in the functional approach, we can dynamically create an object and dynamically type it as well. So combined with the inject function being available, from Angular and could be used in functions themselves as well, that allowed us to have SignalStore, rethink SignalStore, right? And rethink state management, actually, rethink local state management as well, and create it in a functional way where we can dynamically type the whole thing. So SignalStore takes a different approach. Right now, it's basically a function that you declare. And the way you declare the function you declare the SignalStore function, and then within that function, you start using what we call the basic building blocks of SignalStore. And those building blocks consist of a few things. One of them, the first one, for example, and usually that's what we start with, is with state function. And with state functions declares, hey, this is the state that I care about for this SignalStore. All right. So with state, basically uses the same as a state signal under the hood that we just talked about. So it creates an object that has nested signals. All right. So that's, everything has a state, and that the whole SignalStore cares about state. So with state is typically the first thing you comes into play. Now, the second thing that you typically want is now you want to operate on that state or have some derived state. So derived state is the state that's inferred from this. For example, say you have a state, you have like an array of something, but you, in particular case, you only care about the length, right? Length is a derived state, and derived state, you basically say, hey, this is my array.length, whatever, right? Or filtered something, right? So you have to-do's array, and you want to have it filtered by a specific search term or something like that, right? So if your search term is part of the state, now the filter down array would be basically that array.filter, but that's a derived state. And this is a computed value. In Angular signals, computed is basically a derived state, right? This establishes the relationship between the sources of truth, which is your array and your search term, for example, and the outcome of this, which is your filtered array, for example. All of that is set up. You basically declare, right? It's declared way. You declare that this depends on this and this, so it's automatically recomputed for you every time. And that's the beauty of signals, right? That's the whole point of them. So that's the second thing. It's called with computed, where you can declare your computed derived dependencies, right? So now you have a state, you can have some derived value, but you want to also operate on that state. You can want add values or whatever else, right? Somehow change them. And this is where with methods comes in. It's the next building block. So with methods allow you to declare some of the methods that would be manipulating the state or one way or another. They could be calling APIs, right? They could be calling this and that, or they could be directly just putting the value into the store. We call it the patch state. We can patch the state, and we will say, hey, this with the store, patch it with the new value. So that's number 3. And the fourth building block is our hooks for initialization and destruction, right? So what you want to do when you initialize the store, or what you would do when you destroy the store. Now, I think it's a good point here to say that the store itself could be provided in root, right? So then you have a singleton version for the entire app. Obviously, then initialization will run immediately once it's used, injected anywhere. Or it could also be tied to a specific component or specific node in your component tree, right? If you do that, then it's tied to the life cycle of that component or that node, meaning that whenever that component is created, your on init hook would be called. Whenever that component is destroyed, your on destroy hook would be called. And you might want to have some additional logic there, right, to do something about this. And this is why SignalStore could be also used for component state, which is really awesome. So those are basically the 4 main building blocks of a SignalStore. And it's all wrapped in a function.
Nice. I'm also curious if, have you collaborated with the Angular team during the implementation to ensure library aligns with the quality and the roadmap, or any other teams maybe?
Yeah, we are still having actually the regular meetings with the Angular team and with other state management authors, where we discuss about libraries, community state management library, but also about signals and features that they provide. But yeah, when it comes to SignalStore design, this was our thing.
Yeah, that's true. We've been talking to the Angular team nonstop since Angular team was even coming up with the signals proposal, right? They reached out and say, hey, how would that play in a larger, how would it affect NgRx? Let's take a look, right? So we've been basically collaborating with them since pre-announcements of Angular signals. So day one, basically from day one.
Yeah, Alex and Pavel also, when the initial SignalStore version was created, like the prototype, I shared it with them, and they also gave me some feedback, also challenged us, like what can be improved. And as Alex mentioned, also they help us with suggestions on how to integrate signals with other state management libraries that we have, with Component Store and NgRx Global Store.
Nice. So are there any plans for SignalStore to become, I don't know, the default state management tool for the Angular framework?
I mean, Angular team cannot just pick a winner or whatever, right? Like this is community libraries, and there are a number of Angular community state management libraries, NgRx being one of them. NgRx currently is the most popular one. I think Global Store still has a strong lead among any state management libraries. Component Store is, I think right now is the second one, and SignalStore.
Component Store is still growing, by the way. Yeah, it's close to
Yeah.
200K, I think, or it already reached 200K.
Yeah, so it is still growing. All three of them are growing, and of course, SignalStore is experiencing and just like exponential growth right now. So it's growing very fast. But there is a reason for that, right? And I think we can kind of jump into like why do we need the third one as well? Why do we need the third one? We kind of talked already about it being function based, but being function based is great. And we kind of talked about the typing. What we didn't mention yet is how you can create your custom owned features for the Signal Store based on the same four basic building blocks, which you can reuse. So if you actually look at the Signal Store implementation itself, that function, what it takes, it doesn't care if you provide it with state, it doesn't care if you provide it like with methods or whatever else. All it takes is just Signal Store features function. So it is looking for specific signature, right? And that means you can basically create your own. So Signal Store itself provides this Signal Store feature function that where you can wrap any of those four building blocks and create variations on your custom features. And this custom features that can be reused for the same Signal Store among different Signal Stores you might have in your library. And this is the superpower that the functional approach gives you. None of the things in the class-based approach will allow you to do this. And this was the tipping point where we said, hey, this is like definitely has to go in, right? And this is basically the reason why we have the third state management library. Even though it's very close to the component store, it supersedes component store because it can do all component store can do plus much more, being extensible. And that extensibility, again, is a huge, superpower of a Signal Store. Because now you can wrap many different functionalities that are more, fine-grained tailored to something. We have examples of those custom features that are also part of the Signal Store package as well. For example, entities. Entities is basically custom feature for the Signal Store. And entities allows you to work with the collections of something. Many people were probably familiar with the NgRx/entity, right? That was the entity package for Global Store. But what it basically allows you to do is instead of keeping data, your collection data in an array format, which is very hard to work with, especially when you try to put items in, delete items out, because you need to keep the whole array immutable, right? That's the way NgRx approaches things, is through immutability. So it's kind of a hard requirement. But manipulating arrays is quite error prone. Plus, if you need to find an item, it's always looping through the entire array, right? So entities allows you to, it's a different data structure that is abstracted away from you, but it basically allows you to instantly get an item out. If you want to replace the item, it can help you do it with basically one function call in a nice immutable way, type safe, all these things. They're performant as well. And entities is basically one of the custom features that SignalStore provides. But you can create your own custom features. And we already see a number of community plugins for SignalStore that create, that wrap some functionality, either for data fetching or going as far as making SignalStore action-based, like Redux-based kind of thing. So there's a big variety of plugins that are already out there for it.
Yeah, let me quickly get back to your question, Yaroslav, about like our thoughts on having SignalStore as a part of the Angular framework. I mean, as any other thing, it would have advantages and disadvantages. If it becomes like integral part of the framework, then one of the advantages will be to have like most of the Angular projects will be very consistent, right? When you switch from the code base to another code base, it will be more, you will have always the unified stack of libraries. And this is what we have in Vue.js ecosystem, for example. Vue.js team created a state management solution called Pinia, and this is definitely the most popular state management solution in Vue ecosystem. And when you switch from code base to code base, it's very uniform. You are using the same state management solution. You are using the same, more or less the same folder structure, architecture, and it's also easier to onboard new engineers. It's also easier if you need to do some migrations, refactorings from project to project. Tasks will be very similar. On the other hand, with the current approach, I mean, as a library author, if your idea ends up in a framework, this will be like the best validation for you, right? But on the other hand, I prefer the current way of doing things, because this way we have more flexibility. Angular team exposes primitives, and then community has a chance to build different state management solutions in case of signals on top of these primitives. So everyone can pick what suits them best, what they like the most, etc.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I have very related question to that. So can SignalStore be used in conjunction with other state management libraries? Is it something that you recommend, or is it a good idea?
Yes. So SignalStore can be used together with global NgRx store, for example. You can use SignalStore to manage the local state, the component state, and you can still use global NgRx store for the global state management. So this is possible because, as I mentioned, like for the local state, SignalStore is successor of component store. As we used store and component store together, we can now use store and SignalStore.
Yeah, it's definitely, and they both interact quite well with each other. There's no problem with them. You basically use Global Store as just another injectable within SignalStore, right, to access data that you need, or you can even dispatch things out of it if you want to. So it's both direction work fine. And we should probably mention here, like the component store. So the SignalStore is a successor for the component store, but we're not planning to deprecate component store anytime soon. So if you're using it, it's still there, it's stable, we'll maintain it, not going anywhere. Don't have to rush to just switch everything to a SignalStore. But what we do recommend is if you do new development and you're already on the Angular version at least 17 plus, ideally 18 plus, then you can use Angular signals and SignalStore instead.
Yeah, definitely no plans to deprecate component store. It will be still maintained and improve over time, because the second most popular state management solution. And by the way, when we initially were thinking about SignalStore, the first big questions that we had, and I remember when me, Alex, and Brandon discussed this at NgConf 2023, was like, should we create a separate package? Or maybe should we expose a new API as a part of the component store? Or maybe should we modify the component store directly? And one of the reasons why we decided to go with a separate package was to avoid making breaking changes in the component store package. Because usually NgRx, I mean, our contributors and people who are opening issues, suggest new features, they know this. We don't easily accept new features. But when we accept something, you can be sure that it won't be easily removed or deprecated. We guarantee stability.
So if developers are already using NgRx, is there like an easy way for them to migrate to SignalStore?
It depends what you mean by NgRx. If you mean by the global store, there's probably no direct need to migrate to it. It's a problem solved slightly different way, right? And again, if you're already using global store, you might want to shift some of your things to more local, but that's if you have to and if you're thinking about it. If you are thinking about it, then you can just start utilizing SignalStore for those parts. And there's advantages and disadvantages of a local state, right? One of the biggest advantages, that state is not there until the node component tree is there, right? Once it's initialized, then you get that state and there's no actions, right? You can basically directly access things and directly call those methods on that store within that component tree, which is great. And the other advantage is, once you move away from that component, say to another page, that component is destroyed. That state is automatically destroyed and cleaned up, right? So could be an advantage because once you get back, you need to query things first before you have that state. Or it could be disadvantage. Hey, do you want to persist that in your cache or not, right? So it just solves different problems. So it very much depends on the architecture of your app. How much do you want to have in a global store and how much you want to have in a local store? And I've seen different apps where sometimes this very thin layer on top. Every page has its own thing, right? And once you navigate between those pages, they're not sharing much with each other, right? So in that case, do you even need a global store altogether? Maybe you can do single stores for every page or, as many as you need. And you can just have another signal store in the injected in root, basically singleton, where you would have a thin layer of shared things. So then you don't need a global NgRx, like Redux-based one at all. Redux is good for when you have an action that you need to dispatch, and that action will be handled by multiple reducers, multiple effects. That is the beauty of the action, because now your component doesn't care where you handle things, and multiple streams of work can be separated and starting at the same time. But if you always need to call one specific thing, then you have the action for no reason, right? And then if most of your application is just like that, then probably SignalStore is what you actually need anyway for the entire app, right? So think of it, how much of your app could benefit from event-based Redux type of thing, or you can just go all the way with SignalStore. Very much depends. Or you can benefit from both. So what we provide is basically tools, and we can provide some guidance, but at the end, it's your app and your architecture, how you fit this piece together. But what we are saying is we're filling pretty much all the use cases that you might have, right? Before we had local state management library, the full component store, there was only Redux-based global store. And there were some voids, because you can probably try to put too much state in your global store, and things like that. Now there is tools for each specific use case. So it's up to your team to architect the solution that kind of works best for you, but we're enabling you to do that.
Yeah, let's speak a little bit more about that. So I understand that you are providing a tool and the architects can do whatever they want, but are there any best practices, something that you will say, don't do that or always do this thing?
Like one of the things that we recommend if you are working on the new app, for example, is like start small, right? Start with say SignalStore, start at the local state. If you see it's being shared further among components, push it up the component tree, right? No problem. And you don't have a SignalStore, it's not just one of them, right? You could have as many as you need to. Each one should be responsible for specific slice of state, basically specific thing, right? I should have a purpose. It should be a single source of truth for that specific information, right? And then if you do see that, hey, you need more need for, like, again, more event-based, more action-based things, you need to trigger multiple things, you need to cache it between all, then you may, get the global store in as well for some of the things. So that is my recommendation. But Marko, do you have your recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, starting with local state, that's always something that we recommend. And yeah, later when it comes to scaling with SignalStore, there are also plenty of options. You can scale by feature, so you can create custom features and scale SignalStore in that way. But with SignalStore, it's also possible to do a scaling that we have with global Redux store. So we can also create a feature for methods, for example, feature for computed signals, custom feature for state. This is also possible. So there are plenty of options on what can be done. SignalStore can be used for both local and global state. One also, the advantages of the SignalStore compared to global store is also the size. So if you're developing enterprise application, if you're developing application that has a lot of events, that is very interactive, then the benefit of global NgRx store will be very important, and you will probably go with that. But if you're building some, for example, public application that does not have some very complex state management logic, does not need to share a lot of data slices across the pages, and for bundle size is very important to you, then you can go all in with the SignalStore, because the size of the SignalStore of NgRx signals package in the final bundle will be between 0.5 and 2 kilobytes based on the used APIs. We really try to make it as small as possible and tree shakeable. So only APIs that we are using will end up in our final bundle.
That's actually the tree shakeability of it and being able to remove unused things is one other advantage of a functional approach.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, thank you for a very detailed answer. I have one last question that came to my mind. So the SignalStore is very big library, or I wouldn't say big in a context of a size, but it allows you to do many things. And it depends on the Angular itself or the breaking changes that the Angular team makes. Do you plan to be in sync with them and release the same time as Angular framework is released, or you have your own schedule and roadmap for NgRx?
For a long time, NgRx releases are synchronized with Angular releases. So current version of Angular is version 18, NgRx is also on version 18. And we are we are following their release cycle. So we have the same.
Yeah, just to add to this, it's very much the case for many, many years where Angular release is there and then NgRx release is coming out within, sometimes as little as a week, sometimes as long as like a month, maybe two after this. So we try to keep the versions compatible, right? And we try to guarantee compatibility for that same version of Angular. And it's interesting you mentioned that Angular is a dependency. That's true. We also have an optional RxJS dependency, which is interesting. Although Angular signals, it's working towards or with NgRx signal, working with the Angular signals. We also have optional RxJS dependency because we have an optional RxJS utility where we can bring in some of the RxJS into the SignalStore. And you might be wondering, why do we even need that, right? Isn't signals should replace, because signals are not replacing RxJS. RxJS still shines in the asynchronicity, right? So think of your API requests or API calls, right? This is where we feel RxJS can, again, really shine, especially when you're trying to handle the race conditions. This switch map, merge map, exhaust map, concat map kind of situations where you need to cancel previous things or cancel existing things or, put things in sequence calls or make them in parallel. All of these things are still RxJS can handle really, really well. So that's where we have an optional dependency for RxJS to allow to bring that functionality for you. Yeah, so that's basically where we are at with that.
Yeah, before signals, we used RxJS as all-in-one weapon, right? We used it for state, we used behavior subject, and we used RxJS also for performing asynchronous side effects. And right now with signals and with the SignalStore, we are trying to take best from both worlds by using signals for state, and we can still use RxJS for the asynchronous side effects. And as Alex mentioned, in case of NgRx signals package, RxJS is an optional dependency. So we provide an optional RxJS integration if people still want to take advantage of RxJS for async side effects, but it's not required. If people don't want to use RxJS, they can go with promises, for example. It's totally fine. SignalStore will support that as well.
Yeah, thank you for the answer. Switching topics a bit as we are getting close to the end. I notice you are looking for contributors for open issues on a GitHub. Is it still the case?
Yes, we are always looking for new contributors. And currently we have several open issues. So if anyone is interested to contribute, they can go to our GitHub repository, NgRx/platform, and there they can search open issues by accepting PR's label. So now we have a few open issues for documentation contributions, and documentation is usually a very good way to start contributing somewhere if you're interested. This is how I started, for example. I started with documentation, then with some smaller fixes, and then started working on the features and more complex things.
Yeah, exactly. And should probably say announce here too that we recently got a new core contributor, right? Or as well, Reiner joined the team as a main contributor as well. And again, this is the same ways, starting with looking at the smaller things and then contributing with the larger things. That's typically the path.
Yeah, we encourage everyone to contribute and help improve SignalStore and the Angular ecosystem in general. All right, that's a wrap up for today's episode of Angular Catch-Up. Huge thanks to Alex and Marko for sharing their insights with us. It's been awesome having you guys on our podcast, and we hope you found today's episode informative and engaging. Join us again for our next episode coming very soon. We'll have another special guest joining us for an exciting discussion.
Yeah, and don't forget to subscribe to our Angular Catch-Up to stay updated on the latest episodes.
Until next time.
And happy coding.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you.